Hi everyone, welcome to week 11, and this week is quite important for all of us because this is the elections week. So I'll get into it directly because of the limited time. So today we'll cover 3 to 4 things basically. So first we'll visit why do people vote and who does vote, and then we'll move on to how people vote because that's also quite important. So the ideological leaning of the people, whether they vote for which political parties, what determines their decisions. And then we'll visit something called realignment theory. So we'll come to that. So we'll go over that. So basically, it's a theory of electoral realignment which seeks to explain changes in the party system and kind of subject to a range of criticisms. And the fourth one, what kind of strategies help the politicians to win the elections. So I hope I'll have time for that, but let's move on. So when you look at the general picture in the United States, in the elections, people do not necessarily vote as much as they do in other democratic systems like Europe. So, for instance, when you look at the average numbers of voter turnout, it is between 55% to 65%. So, in non-presidential elections, in midterm elections, it can even get worse, like around 40% or even less. So, we'll talk about the reasons for that. So, what could be possible reasons that people not necessarily choose to vote in the US? So, one reason might be many citizens might feel their vote does not make any difference. So we'll definitely come to that. Citizens also feel that there is a lack of quality candidates. I think it was quite obvious in 2016 elections, even this year, when people are asked, they not necessarily prefer any of the candidates, but they are going to vote only because of their party identification or their values. So people also do not necessarily show interest. So clear-cut choices due to the nature of the two-party system, and many of you actually brought this in your short essays as well. We'll definitely talk about two-party system, especially on Thursday. And the negative television advertisement, actually research is quite complicated in this because some research shows that negative campaigning kind of helped voter turnout. So the registration process is quite different between the US and other countries, especially in some southern states. We call it actually voter repression. So it is extremely difficult for people to get registered. So Americans most of the time must register personally. So it also accounts for that difference. And then the day of election. So in almost none of the countries, actually, you can see that elections are held on a Tuesday. So it's a kind of a tradition in this country, but of course it makes it very difficult for people who have to work in 2-3 different jobs. So in most of the other countries, especially in Europe, the election day is Sunday so that more people can actually go out and vote. And the ballot structure is also another important component of it. The US, the ballot is very long. It includes local, state, and national candidates in the same ballot, and it's quite overwhelming for many people. And there is also a quite interesting theory about voting. So there is a very important economist, Anthony Downs. He wrote about the economic theory of democracy. So in that one, he kind of focused on the individual calculation of voting, and he come up with the argument that actually voting is not rational. When we talk about rationality, the assumption is that people do behave in the way that it actually benefits their interests. Otherwise, they not necessarily act on it. So if you take this assumption, then the cost and benefit analysis of voting, the costs most of the time are higher than the benefits for the individual from the individual perspective. But then, of course, you can always ask the question, if Downs was right, then we wouldn't see or observe the majority of the people in many societies would not even vote, right? So, but people do. So how are we going to explain that, right? So why do people vote? Or you can also capture that question from the other perspective, why people do not necessarily vote. So when people are asked about this question, for instance, in 2008 presidential elections, so many people said that they were too busy to vote. So there is also illness and disability among the answers. So they are not interested, did not like the candidates. Another answer, they were out of town. So the US society is quite mobile. So people are traveling all the time. Of course, under the current conditions, it's not that easy anymore. So there are registration problems. It's quite important. So transportation problems. So even though we live in New York City, so you also always need to think about the rural areas where public transportation is much more limited. So these are some reasons that people actually said why they prefer not to vote. So the positions of non-voting. So is it good or bad for the democracy? There are two different school of thoughts. One says that low voting is bad for democracy because non-voting illustrates a lack of legitimacy. It's one way to interpret it. The other school suggests that non-voting means citizens are basically satisfied with democracy. So Americans vote less when compared to Europeans, and this school of thought says that Americans are more satisfied with democracy. I think it's more difficult to say the same thing or make this argument in today's America. People are less satisfied with the current political system. So basically, who does vote though? So on average, I think when we try to make a profile for the average American voter, that person probably should be the middle age, better educated, who lives in a more urbanized area, urban, and likely to identify with a political party. So those four things are quite important to explain who actually does vote when it comes to just that decision to vote, right? So income and education are very important demographics when it comes to the determining the voting decision. So people with high income levels are much more likely to vote. People with higher education levels vote at higher rates. So, and then of course you can always ask the question, why is that the case? So one explanation is higher education leads to a feeling that you at least have some power, a little power, but kind of means to influence the system. And it is basically about efficacy, right? The answer is basically efficacy is much more higher for citizens who are professionals. So, and much lower for those in working class. So education also has the effect of broadening interests and increasing the perception of having a stake in the system. So people believe, if they believe that they have stake in the system, it's more likely for those people to go out and vote. But of course, there are also changes in this kind of explanation. So, for instance, especially starting with 21st century, there are some other explanations in advanced industrialized societies where we have the emergence of post-materialist values. So what are they? So post-industrial societies are moving their economies from manufacturing into knowledge and information industries. So because of that, there is a shift of values away from society towards self. So people are much more individual. So they like to act on their individual self-interest even more. So personal things start even matter more in this new age. So relationships, right? Whether you follow a correct diet, so a healthy lifestyle, outdoor activities, music, people are so much into music. Of course, you can always say that these things do not necessarily suppress, the willing, the enthusiasm that people can show in politics. I think I can agree with that, but on the other hand, we do have actually limited time, right? If you spend most of your time in these kind of activities, then you do not necessarily have enough time that you need to spend for being active in politics. So social and political questions no longer interest many people. And you can follow that actually in the shift of the topics in popular pop culture TV shows, right? For instance, you can always think about Sex and the City and the modern version of it, which is The Girls. Also, I think we can maybe talk more about this on Thursday if we can have any chance, of course, because we'll probably talk more about the election results. So then next question is, of course, who votes how, right? So how are we going to understand or explain the blocks of people voting for liberal or conservative or multiple other parties? So party identification is a very important determinant in the voting decision in the United States. So party identification, if people have stronger party identification, they have a tendency to vote for the same political party over and over again. So then, of course, can party ID predict election results? It's difficult to say, especially in 2016 elections. This is one of the reasons that actually people got surprised in some states. You see the shift from blue to red, so that Donald Trump actually won the elections, even though Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by more than 2 percentage points. There are other things that I actually talked about last week. Class voting, regional voting, race and ethnicity. We'll probably talk about those on Thursday. But I want to talk a little about the electoral realignment. So party ID is still probably the most important determinant of the how people vote in the United States. But there is a theory called electoral realignment which explains the change in party ID. And some political scientists actually argue that the most recent elections might be also a good example of seeing or explaining the it can be explained by the party or realignment theory. But of course, we need to revisit the history. So what are the elections that people refer when they start to talk about realignment? Blocks of people changing their party ID. I'm not talking about individuals. So when you go back in 1860, so before the even the Civil War, the United States at that time was perfectly divided between South and North. The South wanted to extend, of course, the slavery to the Pacific, and North wanted to limit its existing slave states. So the Republicans at that time nominated Abraham Lincoln, and Southern Democrats nominated Vice President John Breckinridge, and they run a pro-slavery platform. And as usual, Republicans are in red and Democrats in blue, if you are interested in the map that you can see right now. So basically, Lincoln won less than even 40% of the popular vote, and not even having appeared even the ballots in the most southern states, and won the election. So basically, his electoral college victory proved how politically powerful a unified North could be. And then things between 1884 and 1896. So Democrats had returned to electoral competitiveness by accepting many of the political premises of the industrial development. And at that time, the stage was set for the gold standard, which was good for the industrial interests in the East, but hard on the farmers in the South and the Midwest. So the grievances of farmers and rural people found expression in the populist party. It's almost like the election of Donald Trump. You can kind of see the parallels there. And in this one also, in the election of 1896, it was fought on the currency issue, and the result produced a sharp industrial agrarian divide, and the divide again favors the North. And then the last one is 1932. I think you are much more familiar with that. So the economic depression began under the Republican Party's watch. And then the party's response was quite contested, especially the president at that time, Herbert Hoover, failed to address the crisis, so that the New York governor, Franklin Roosevelt, who had a great reputation, last name, and the solid reputation on his own, especially he had he was the governor, and he ran a very good policy agenda in New York, and there is a very broad trans-regional consensus, so that he won 1932 elections by a big margin. So those are the things that you can consider to explain the current elections or the most recent elections. We'll come to that. I'm out of time, so let's meet on Thursday and talk more about these issues. Please think about these issues until Thursday, and have a nice day.